couple of weeks ago, we began this topic, and I mentioned the need for a standard outside of ourselves. We need to have some objective standard, some absolute basis of truth. Just a quote that I came across this week that I thought was apropos. John Hendricks runs a contemporary theological website, and he is quoted as saying, "Moral outrage is absurd if you reject objective truth." Man, that is so profound in such a simple way. And that is exactly the hypocrisy of our culture. On the one hand, they'll say everybody's right. You can do whatever you want. Who are you to tell me that your 10 Commandments need to be obeyed? I can do what I want to do. And then all of a sudden, now immediately by that, we're now in a confusing state of everybody is automatically right. And if we're all on equal plane morally, then everybody decides what's true. And we are never in a position to say, that's a moral outrage. I can't believe that happened. Who are you to say that's a moral outrage? The person who did that is living by their standard, and their standard allows them to do that. So you have no right to now call that a moral outrage. The hypocrisy of this kind of relativistic thinking is so quickly clear to everybody except the relative thinker. We must have something outside of ourselves that gives us a moral, objective basis of truth. We need absolute truth, and absolute truth exists. If you sometimes talk to people that tell you that absolute truth does not exist, that you cannot say something is true for all people in all time, in all places, it's always true 100% of the time. There's no absolute truth, except for the truth that there's no absolute truth. The whole logic of such a statement just falls apart. We do need it. And so I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we are spending some time looking at the 10 Commandments. I also mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago that we're going to be learning the 10 Commandments. I hope you don't think this is too juvenile, and even if you do, I can't help that. But we're going to learn the 10 Commandments. We're going to do this morning. I'm going to walk you through them. I'm going to give you a little means, I hope, of some hooks to hang the commandments on, so you'll get to know them and get to know the order of them. It's maybe something you've already got down pat, and I know and I recognize, and you do too, that knowing these in your head is one thing. That's all great. You can be a horribly immoral person and have all these memorized. That's not the point. It's to put them in your head. But ultimately, you can't live them out if you don't have them in your head. So it's good for us to have this basis, and I think it's quite sad that often our Christian church doesn't even know these commandments. You know the gist of them, but not them in order, and not what they are fully. So here's what we're going to do. If you don't want to participate, that's okay. I'm going to pretend that you're just catching on, and eventually you will. But we're going to use some hand signs. I know I told you this. Somebody feels a little bit juvenile, but just go with this, and you'll actually learn the 10 Commandments. And if you're interested in learning them in order, then you'll want to participate. And those of you who are sitting like this, humph, I already got your picture. That's okay. Yeah, you're backsliding. I understand. We'll pray for you. Okay, so here's what you're going to do. Hold up one finger like this. You're pointing to the ceiling. You're pointing to God. And this is number one, of course, and you're saying there's one God, no other gods. This is how you're remembering. All you have to do is remember what your hand side should be, and you'll immediately remember what the commandment is. No other gods, one God. Now, two. We're going to put our two fingers up like this. I know you normally do this, but this is a hand sign, okay? Two. If you can get to here, if you can remember this, you're good to go. All right? This finger that just this is pointing to God. There's one God. This finger is now going to bow down to that God. No bowing down. No idols. Okay, number two, no idols. Number three, make three with your fingers, and we have a representation of God, if you will. This is just figurative, just for the sake of illustration. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, push these together and put them on your lips. Do not take God's name in vain. Right? Number three. Number four, this is kind of goofy, but it actually helps me remember it because it is kind of silly. If you turn those over and make little feet, now you have a family walking to church. I know it doesn't really work real well. Okay? But that's what we've got. So four, remember the Sabbath. Now some people do it this way. They take two and two and make a church, make a roof, whatever suits you, okay? Whatever works, whatever little memory jog there is. Keep the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Five, open hand. What do you do with an open hand? You give your child a what for on the behind. Not that you ever would, of course. Honor your parents, okay? Slap across the face, whatever you think that open hand looks like for you. Honor your parents. Number six. This is number three in sign language. You're going to make 2 3s. Okay, this is actually 3, 4, 5. This is a 5. No, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is 8 in sign language, just for the record. Okay? This is a 3. Okay, you're going to make 2 3s. This is an easy one. Put your fingers together. Suddenly you know, do not kill. All right? You're just going to remember your 6 fingers. No killing. This is number 7. Number 2 fingers here. Number 5 over here. These 2 fingers are together. Squish them together. 2 shall be wrapped by the 5. Always together. No committing adultery. Those 2 are held together by those 5 for life. No committing adultery. Number 8. This is kind of odd, but here you're going to put a 5 and a 3. Okay? And you're going to do this. You're going to bump this over, and you're going to grab a thumb and give yourself a pinky. If you can't do it, that's okay. Lou will give you instructions later. It's not that hard. Okay, you're going to steal. The 5 is going to steal. The 3 is going to steal 1, and you're going to have 4 and 4. No stealing. All right? If you just have to remember that, you've got number 8, no stealing. Number 9, hold your hands up this way. Make sure I don't see your thumb. Show me the back of your hands. Right? You're going to tell me you have 10 fingers because why? You're lying. I know you have 1, you're hiding 1. You're telling me a lie. I knew you had 10 the whole time. So number 9, do not lie. Number 10, easy one. 2 big hands. Number 10, grab everything you've got and grab it to yourself because you're coveting. You want it all. You want everything there is. We'll go through those each week. I'm not going to review them now because by the time we're done this after 10 weeks, you'll have it all memorized and you'll know it flat and you'll know it cold. We're going to learn the 10 Commandments with simple hand signs. I know it seems a little silly, but it's good for us to have those in our head and understand what they are. It's good on one level to know what the basis of the coldness of the words are, but what do they mean? And hopefully each week as we unfold them, we'll begin to understand a little fresher what that means to say, for example, there shall be no other gods. What exactly is God meaning when he declares that we are to obey this command? Why is he in a position to make that claim that we should put him in the place of supremacy? The actual text in Exodus 20 that we're looking at is verses 1 to 2, and it simply says this: God spoke all these words, saying, this is to Moses, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And here's the command: you shall have no other gods before me. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's the preamble. That's what he has to say even before he gets to the command. Why does he begin this command with this little bit of an introduction of who he is? Does Moses not know who he is? I think there's more to it than that. God is laying some groundwork for this command. And before we get to the actual command of verse 3, you shall have no other gods, let's take a few moments and just look at verse 2. Get to understand, what is God saying? Why does he begin this way? Why does the command begin with these words, I am? I am. Does that sound familiar to you? I can't help but think that immediately Moses' mind was whisked back in time. Every time he hears the words, I am, he would have remembered a moment when he first encountered God. And if you know the scriptures and know the book of Exodus, you're already recounting back in your mind. You know what I'm referencing. I am. And that little phrase is an actual, rather intriguing little phrase in the original. And it's actually kind of almost mysterious what it really means. But I am was the name, if you remember, that God himself gave to Moses at the burning bush. Moses saw this bush and said, I'm going to draw aside and see this great thing. Why the bush does not burn up. There's a fire. It was not unusual to see a brush fire on a mountain, lightning strike, and whatever else in the heat of a desert. There could be a brush fire. But this fire was different. And he drew aside. He recognized there's something peculiar about this. And he approached it. Can I tell you that that's the way every church, in a sense, should be, a burning bush. Something peculiar about them. There's a fire that is burning within them that makes no sense. There's something about them that is unusual. I'm going to draw aside. I want to see what this thing is in your life. You should be a burning bush. Moses drew aside, and rightly so, to explore this, and you know what happened. He encountered God, and God chose to reveal himself to Moses in a most peculiar way. God is invisible. God is not of this realm, if you will, this place. He's not something we can see and touch and smell and taste. And so God has to come in to our dimension in a way that we can understand. And he represented himself in a fire. in a bush. And when Moses said to him, "Who shall I say is sending me?" back to the Israelites, God introduced himself with this name. Who shall I say? What is your name? He knew all the gods in Egypt had names. He knew all the gods in Egypt had histories and beginnings and all that they had gone on. They've all got their thing. Everybody knows those gods, but you're not that God. How do I explain to them who you are? What do I tell them about you? He says, I am. Wow, that's a really odd name. I am. And God, in a sense, was capturing something of his very being and expressing himself even in that fire. He was showing that there's a fire that burns without fuel. He is a God that doesn't need anything outside of himself. He is independent of everyone. God is eternal. This fire would go on and on. It doesn't need fuel. It would just keep burning. God showed himself to Moses, and he said, I am. Now, this little phrase, I am, is kind of peculiar in literally, it means I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. And God was declaring in himself, I just am who I am, and I am just existing beyond everything else, and I'm independent of everything else. I am supreme. I'm going to pick up on that in a few minutes. We're going to look at this next little phrase. He says, I am, I just exist. I just eternally exist, independent of everything else. I need no fuel to exist. I don't need you. And I am the Lord. Now, here's a very tricky little phrase. That word Lord in English, in our English Bible, we translate it capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Because we don't know what this word is. I don't know if you're aware of that. We have just borrowed the English word Lord, made capitals out of it to distinguish it, because it's that word again. And there's a Hebrew word for God, for God's name, that is untranslatable. I don't know if you're aware of that. We don't know what the word is or what the name is. In fact, if you're traditionally Jewish and you're reading the scriptures, when you get to that name, you don't even pronounce it. It is unpronounceable, and it is offense to try and pronounce it. We're not Jewish, and we don't hold any superstitious notions to it, but the letters are, to translate into English, Y-H-W-H. No vowels. Doesn't really mean much. And the best we've done is try and come up with some Anglo-Saxon way of capturing some way to pronounce that, and we invented a name that comes out of this, Jehovah. That's how we got our name from. We took those sound of those letters, Yahweh, it looks like, and we anglicized it into a name, and we just made that up. But there is deep mystery in this word. There is a sense that we don't even know who God is in this word. This word expresses something of God, that he is beyond us. He is greater than us. I am the self-existent one. I have always been. I am the Lord. I am now, he uses the word that we don't even know what that word means. We don't even know how to express it. It is derived from a verb, we think, that means to be or to exist, but there's deep mystery to it. And this is how the very first way he expresses to Moses. In the very opening words of the Ten Commandments, he begins with an introduction to himself. If you want to get the commandments right, you need to know who you're dealing with. I am the Lord. Well, those are awesome words. They carry more weight than I think I'm able to express, and perhaps more weight than our ears are able to digest, and our hearts are able to understand. This is God we're talking about, and if we want to start to go a kilter, get askew anywhere, it is in the character of God. Now, I don't know if I'm about to go down a rabbit trail. In my mind earlier in the week, I saw a direct connection to everything I'm about to say to where I am now. And as the week wore on, I began to wonder if I was out of my mind. But here we go. Hopefully you'll see what I'm trying to say. Hopefully it'll make sense to you in this illustration. Many of you may know the name Norman Vincent Peale. It's funny how people on both sides know this name. On one level, a lot of people know him for his most popular book that came out in the 50s, power of positive thinking. On the other hand, a lot of people know of him as a minister. He had a television program and a radio program, and depending on your era, and of course, being American and we're not on that side of the border, he may not be fully understood to us. But this man, if I can say politely without being too pejorative about somebody whom I never met, this man changed the presentation of the character of God to the modern church. If you want to know and find the touchstone that you can trace back to all the confusion, often the confusion and the false teaching of the age that we live in now, in regards to God, you can trace it back to this man's thinking. This man birthed an idea that still lives today. It is so entrenched often in our churches and in our doctrines that what I'm about to say to you has begun to sound like heresy, because how dare you say that, because I've always been taught that. God has been changed. I am the Lord. By virtue of that statement, he is unchangeable. He is always independent of you and of me. Now, let me just follow this. There is nothing that you can do to influence him, because he is, I am the Lord. He doesn't fall in love with you because you're good looking, because you were born in a particular nationality or economic state. It's irrelevant to him. He has chosen to pour his love on you because he has. Because he chose from himself without any outside influence from you, because he is independent of everything else, and that's why we call him God. Okay? Well, I'm just trying to stress that so you follow me here. That's who God is. But you know what we've done? Our thinking has actually begun to change to reduce God to a person that we can actually manipulate by our own ideas. And it comes from this man. Let me explain. Let me just give you, if you don't know the book, the chapter titles, for example, are I Don't Believe in Defeat, How to Have Faith in Healing, Power to Solve Personal Problems. It was all based, is spiritually based. He was a preacher. He taught this from the pulpit. He threw in words like God and Jesus, and people bought it like it was part of the package. It was pseudo-psychology. Here's a quote. It gives you some idea of where he's coming from. Any fact facing us is not as important as our attitude toward it, for that determines our success or failure. The way you think about a fact may defeat you before you ever do anything about it. You are overcome by the fact because you think you are. It's all about your mind. If you could just get your head around to think a certain way, your problems would go away. In fact, your thoughts have power in them. Wow, that's interesting news. I had no idea. Here's another quote. Formulate and stamp indelibly on your mind a mental picture of yourself as succeeding. Hold this picture tenaciously. Never permit it to fade. Your mind will seek to develop this picture. Do not build up any obstacles in your imagination. You can have what you can envision. I don't know if this sounds familiar to you, but if you have watched and flipped channels, am I pronouncing his name correctly? Creflo? Is that a name? Creflo Dollar? I have just surmised his theology. If you have listened to Robert Schuller, Joel Osteen, to name a few, Kenneth Copeland, I have just distilled their theology. Stands on the shoulders of a belief that if you think something in your mind and you can screw up enough courage and faith in your own heart and you can mingle your positive thoughts with faith, it is yours. That's a common doctrine today. And if you don't believe so, go into your Christian bookstore and spend about 5 minutes and you can find a stack of books that will tell you you are a child of God. No child of God should not have what a child of God wants, and if you can begin to picture it, if you can think it. I remember flipping channels once, coming across something of these stations, and just sat and decided to watch for a little bit, and it was about you getting what you need. And if you have a need, for example, of real estate, you picture in your mind, this was the sermon, I'm not making this up, picture in your mind that real estate. Picture in your mind that banker. It is going to be yours, and by faith you lay hold of that and you claim it. And when you claim it, God is going to move out and begin to work among you and behind the scenes, and God will begin to pull his strings and do his thing, because you are going to get what you want. Because God can be manipulated by your own thoughts. God can do what you want him to do. God becomes who you want him to be, because God is not independent of you. God is not the Lord, I am. God is what you want him to be, and you get to pull the strings. How cool is that? Wow. And I'll tell you, this has gone all the way through our culture, all the way down to Oprah Winfrey, who preaches this kind of thinking in books like, is it called The Secret? This is nothing more than the same package wrapped up in a different way, and it all stems back to a man who decided to present us with an idea that has permeated the Christian culture and has deviated from who God really is. Can I just stress it again this morning? I am the Lord. He is independent of you in every way. He does not need your opinion, your help, your anything. He's in charge. He is the God of all gods. He is supreme in every way, and he alone sets the rules. And that's the position that he's coming from. And if you've got a God in your mind that somehow is lesser than the one true God, can I try to dislodge that from you? I am the Lord, your God. This little word God is the general word for God that we have in Scripture. In fact, the very first time we find it is in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, same word. What do you know about the first way that God expresses himself in Scripture? He expresses himself as a God who speaks, and it happens. A God who says, and it is. He is the great I am, and I speak into the darkness, and there is light. I am the Lord your God. That's why we listen to the Ten Commandments. Then he expresses again in Genesis 20, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. What does that mean? Well, you know what took place in the book of Exodus and the story of the Exodus. You know that he's referencing back to those events that took place in Exodus 12 all the way to end of 14, and all that transpired with Pharaoh and the plagues and all that happened, and he pulled them out of that place called Egypt. What is he referencing? Why is he going back to that? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, because in Egypt they had no hope. In Egypt they were caught. In Egypt there was no way out. That God himself chose of his own free will to do something for his people. Can I remind you that represents you and represents me? That you and I are born, as it were, in spiritual Egypt. You and I are born in the world that knows nothing of God, multiplicity of gods. You and I are born in a place called Egypt, metaphorically speaking, spiritually speaking, that we have no means of getting out of, except that God himself chose to show love to us and to quicken our eyes and our understanding to our need. And that God stepped in, and that God brought us out of the house of slavery. If you don't think sin is slavery, you know nothing of sin. If you don't think that sin is slavery and understand it, you don't understand sin. If you think that you have never been a slave to sin or can be a slave to sin, then you're probably not a believer, because you just don't understand what we're talking about. And this is the God who's done everything necessary to bring you and I out of spiritual bondage. This God who's presented himself to Moses as the God who speaks these words: you shall have no other gods before me. That has been taken a couple of ways. One way that this is often taken is that you could have other gods, but they just can't be before him. They can't be ahead of him. He has to be the first and the best and the top, and then it's okay as long as you've got other ones, but they don't come and in front of him. You shall have no other gods, I got to be number one. That's not what the text is saying. That little phrase, before me, is actually a curious little one that it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It means before my face, literally. You shall have no other gods before my face. And the nuance, the subtlety of it is that it's talking about a relationship as if, and a marriage relationship. How would you feel, husbands, if you found your wife brought home a different husband? How would husbands you feel if you brought home a different wife, and how would your wife feel? How would it work in your family if you just showed up one day and said, by the way, I picked up another one at the market while I was down, and we're going to go with this today? If you wouldn't think there'd be some tension or some jealousy or some friction, you don't really know what love is. That's just not going to work. That's the idea of this. It's monogamy, spiritual monogamy is what he's calling us to. You shall have no other gods. I am exclusively yours, is the idea of this. And that means, we often hear ourselves say, that you have to make God number one in your life. That's actually not biblical. God is not asking to be number one in your life because, like the misunderstanding of this verse, that implies there can be a number two and a number three and a number four as long as he's number one. He's not asking to be your number one. The command, in its seriousness, I am the Lord your God, the great I am, the supreme being, the all-eternal, all-encompassing God, I am declaring to you, you must make me your exclusive God. I must have all of you, all of your attention, all of your time, and everything else falls by the wayside. I am the number one. That's what this text is saying. Now, right there, off the bat, if you're even remotely honest with yourself, you know you have immediately failed to keep the Ten Commandments. Immediately. This is why we know grace. This is why we're thankful for the cross. This is what the point of the Ten Commandments, to immediately expose our hearts to the inadequacy of ourselves to please and meet the standards of a holy and righteous God. And if you're honest with yourself, you know that you do not make God your number one just because you show up in church on Sunday. I'm sorry, that doesn't really cut it. Romans chapter 1 reminds us, and we'll probably look at this again next week, just how adulterous we are spiritually. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. This is talking about the human race, your heart, my heart. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, resembling mortal man, birds, animals, creeping things. This is more referencing to actual physical idols, which comes up in our second one of the commandments. But the truth of the matter is our hearts are prone, so prone, to be anything but spiritually monogamous. So, you shall have no other gods before me, exclusively. What does that mean? Let's try to be practical in the midst of this. What does that look like? What am I saying? That means you can't have any love for anything beyond God, before God. He wants the exclusive claim for all your attention and all your love. Let me ask you this morning, does your heart, in its truth, do you know that you actually serve the God of prosperity, the God of achievement? Truth be known, if your house was to burn down, it would be the end of all things. Truth be known that if your car was to be destroyed, you would be devastated. Truth be known, if you were to lose your job and find yourself having to depend entirely on God, if everything was stripped away from you, if suddenly your great calling in life, the heights to which you've climbed, and all your achievements and all that you've arrived at and all that you are was suddenly gone, let me ask you, how would your heart feel? Would you at the end of it all still say, I'm clinging to God and to God alone? He gave and he takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Or would you know somehow something in your life is missing? That somehow something's not right, and in fact, God is to blame for this. He has no right. He gave me all these things, and look what he's doing, and I don't know if I can trust him anymore. And your heart turns because it is serving two masters. You're not exclusively God's. You live for yourself. You live for what pleases you. Speaking of which, maybe it's just your own pleasure and your own leisure. Maybe that's the God that you serve. Maybe you are all about just having an easy life. That is all you want out of life, is just to get along, no suffering. Oh sure, I'll show up in church. Oh sure, I'll, give my mental assent to things. But in truth be known, what I'm really looking for in life is to just have it easy. Put my feet up and enjoy myself. I live for my holidays and live for my pleasures. And my goodness, if I can't be a part of what's going on with the Stanley Cup or what's happening with the World Cup, those are the things that are important. Oh, sure. God is interesting. Should go to church, teach your kids Sunday school stuff. That's fine. But did you see what's coming out in the theater next week? Now that has really got my attention. Did you see what that baseball player said, what this movie started? I got to watch the Tonight Show tonight. Do you know who's on it? And you're all about the important gods of this world. If you don't think that this world worships gods, if you don't think that that the human heart is intrinsically encased in idol worship, flip your television on and watch who's Googling after who. And who's bowing down to what somebody can say just because they had some means of being on some celluloid some point in time. And suddenly they have the right to speak, and I'm interested in what they have to say. You're not serving one God. You love the gods of this world. And you're chasing after the gods of this world, and you care about the gods of this world. That God is not exclusive to you. You are a breaker of the first commandment, and you love it so. And you live it so. I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods but me. And our Christian lives are led so comfortably and so easy, and we just do whatever we want, and we somehow have an idea of a God in our minds that really isn't the great I am, who has every claim to us, and who has every right to tell us how to live, and who has every right to declare that anything less is complete anathema. I don't care. He's not that important. He's not really the great I am. Or is your God people? Popularity. What really matters to you is your family. They come first. That's what really matters. Maybe it's just you wanting to be popular. You're a young person, maybe you choose that over God every day of the week. Where is your God? Who do you love? If you have your bulletin, you'll notice that on the left side at the bottom, there's a verse we've printed in there. It's, I believe, from Habakkuk. I'm not sure what the quote is. I don't have the ESV memorized, but it's something like this. Though the fig tree does not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vine, the produce of the olive fail, and there be no herds in the stalls. No, I've got it wrong. Now the produce of the olive fail, though the fields yield no fruit. Oh, I've messed it up. Yet, I'll get to the end, yet will I rejoice in the Lord. That's what I wanted you to see. It doesn't matter that all of those things come to an end. Yet will I rejoice in the Lord. Can you honestly say that you know that's your heart? That you know that that is truly who your God is. All these things be stripped away, and that is your God. And you lay claim to this God and this God alone. Let me remind you this morning that if your heart is chasing after other gods, or loves the gods of this world, or clamors after this world, and wants the accolades and the attention of this world, then you're serving other gods. You are breaking the first commandment. And even if you are a believer this morning and walking in disobedience to God's commands, can I remind you that we all go to the same place? It is called the grace of God, the cross of Christ. You can know a cleansing in your own heart. If God is not your joy, if He is not your all, if He is not the center of your focus, if He is not everything to you, then you are worshiping another God. Can I ask you and challenge you to come afresh this morning to the cross and to find that cleansing, to confess to God your lovelessness, how far away he feels in your own empty spiritual heart that doesn't really feel completely enamored with who he is? Can I ask you to consider, just as we looked at this first commandment, to consider if you've broken it? You need to confess that to God, and you need to know the freedom that he'll give you and the joy of walking with him. Let's pray. Father,